Hengamana, hengareo, hengata wida pumanawa, ro rakatirama, tanakoto, tanatato katoa. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Harlene Hain, and I have the great privilege of being the Vice Chancellor here at the University of Otago, and I would like to warmly welcome each and every one of you to this inaugural professorial lecture for Professor David Bell. Now, as I look out on the audience this evening, I see staff and students from throughout our university. I see former council members who have joined us. And I also see members of the general public. And on behalf of the university, I would like to warmly welcome all of you. But I'd also like to make a special mention of David's family who are here with us this evening. His partner, Helen, his daughter, Melissa, Melissa's partner, Nigel, their sons, Jack and Max, and the youngest son, Tom, and his partner, Lucy. As a university community, we are delighted to have you here with us this evening, and I am sure that your presence is especially important to David. Now, as all of you who are gathered here today know, the rank of professor is the pinnacle of academic achievement. It is only earned on the back of sustained excellence in research, in teaching, and in service to the university and to the profession. Now, as you will soon learn from his lecture, Professor Bell is a productive, sophisticated, and highly accomplished scholar in art education. His high-quality publications and wider contribution to the field are matched by outstanding leadership and innovative teaching, research, and service. He's recognized as a trained teacher, assessor, and an educational reformer. And among all of his other achievements, Professor Bell has also developed an incredibly innovative program for aesthetic and museum-based learning. So David, on behalf of the University of Otago, I would like to congratulate you on your very well-deserved promotion to professor, and very shortly we will invite you to give your inaugural professorial lecture. But before we call upon you, I will call first on Professor Lisa Smith, who is the former Dean of the College of Education, to tell us just a little bit more about David's academic journey. Norera, tenakoto, tanatato katoa.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor. Enamana, enareo, ro rangatirama, no mai, haere mai, toti mai, he mihi, tena koto koto. I am so honored to introduce David Bell, Professor David Bell, from the University of Otago College of Education for his inaugural professorial lecture on why Hokusai's Great Wave matters. As you might expect, David has a most impressive academic record. He earned his PhD in 2003, only 3 years after earning a PG Dip Arts with distinction in Art History and Theory, which was just 3 years after completing his BA in History, Art History and Theory, all from the University of Otago. David also holds a diploma in teaching from the Christchurch College of Education, was awarded in 1975, and a diploma in fine arts from the School of Art at Otago Polytechnic, completed in 1973. Through the years, David has risen through the ranks, beginning with a post as a teacher of visual arts at Hornby High School in Christchurch. He has been head of the art department at King's High School here in Dunedin and for the former Dunedin College of Education, and the coordinator of postgraduate programs for the University of Otago College of Education. His impressive research record, dedication as a teacher and supervisor, talent in his field, and outstanding service record are well known and far too much to tell you about in this brief introduction. So here are just a few highlights. David's research is primarily in the field of art education and aesthetic learning, both in the classroom and in settings such as museums. He's recognized internationally as an expert in substantive aesthetics and in the Japanese visual field, in particular with ukiyo-e. Most recently, David was awarded a major contract with Te Papa Tongariro to evaluate the Hinatori Learning Laboratory at Te Papa. As evidence of David's excellence in teaching, he has been nominated for the past 3 years for an Otago University Student Association Excellence in Teaching Award. David's research record is equally impressive. He has published 5 sole-authored books, 10 book chapters with another accepted, 36 refereed journal articles, 26 book reviews and review articles, and 14 refereed conference proceedings. He is a popular presenter at conferences, both in New Zealand and internationally, has given just under 36 public lectures, and has curated 5 exhibitions and 1 catalog. David is also a leader. To give you just a flavor of his leadership activities, David has served as president of the Aotearoa New Zealand Association of Art Educators, associate editor of the International Journal of the Arts and Society, and as president of the Dunedin Public Art Gallery Society. In 2010, David was elected chair of the Permanent External Advisory Council for the Dunedin School of Art at Otago Polytechnic. David's service is also wide-reaching. For the university, he is convener and vice-chancellor's representative for the Francis Hodgkins Fellowship Committee, serves on the Maori Advisory Group, is the Kaiawhina Maori liaison for postgraduate students, and serves on the selection committee of the University of Otago Wallace Residency at the Pa Homestead. Just this year, David became the associate editor for the International Academic Forum of Art and Humanities, which is based in Japan. David is active in various roles for the Dunedin School of Art, Otago Polytechnic, the Dunedin Public Art Gallery, Toitū Settlers Museum, Otago Museum, King's High School, Kavanagh College, St. Hilda's Collegiate School, and as chair of regional moderation for NCEA Visual Arts Levels 1 and 2 for the Otago region. David has also served for 12 years as the secretary of the Otago Kidney Society. So that's the official Professor David Bell. But I want to tell you a few things that you're not going to find on his CV. David's love of the arts is surpassed by his love of family. And it's so lovely to see so many of his family here tonight. David is one of the best listeners on the planet. David is always there to lend a shoulder to anyone going through a rough time. David always puts his hand up to help, enthusiastically. And I can tell you, I greatly appreciated that when I was Dean of the College of Education, and there were some, shall we say, less than appealing tasks that had to be done. David can be counted on to be the voice of reason in a hui, especially when things start to go to custard. I am convinced that David knows everyone in the field of education, certainly in Dunedin. David can explain anything to anyone in such a way that you cannot help but understand. I've supervised at the doctoral level with David, and his expertise in explaining qualitative research methods is nothing short of incredible. And I will never forget attending one of his lectures on the parts of a marae, the wharenui, and protocol for a visit to a marae. I was not new to New Zealand, but for the first time, I truly understood the why underpinning the what. David loves to travel, and in his travels, he engages in a star quest. Not to see celebrities, not to look at the heavens from different locations, and not to discover new talent. No, David searches for Michelin star restaurants, and then he rates the food and the ambiance. And finally, David knows the value of having a wee dram of the good stuff on occasion. And David, I think this qualifies as one of those occasions. So please join me in welcoming Professor David Bell, our Renaissance man, outstanding scholar, brilliant teacher, magnificent colleague, and my dear friend. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Going? I think we are. Thank you very much. Gosh, if this place folds, there's a future for you both in fiction. Thank you both very much, and thank you to everyone for coming tonight. It's a real privilege to be and work and share in the community of a place like this. Occasions like this, though, sort of turn privilege into intimidation, so I may hiccup a couple of times. I would like to start, in fact, by thanking people, not just for coming here, but one of the things I realised when I reflected on where my research and my teaching, because they intermesh quite closely in my mind at least, where they've come from, and occurred to me as I pondered on this that in fact it doesn't actually emanate from me at all. It's really the outcome of the relationships I've been pleased to enjoy over the last 40-odd years in the profession, both as a teacher in the old College of Education, as a teacher here in the university. So the first thing I want to acknowledge is that research and teaching and learning are sort of a synthesis. They don't occur separately in my life at least, or at least in my head. My research pathway, such as it is quite unconventional, I think. It got off to a very good start in year 13 when one of my teachers actually gave me a diary that he had carefully transcribed from the original in the Hokkien of one of the early settlers on the peninsula. And he said, "Analyse this." He didn't tell me how to analyse this, and he didn't actually explain to me what analysis was. He just left me to it, and it was an object lesson, I think, a little voyage of discovery in which I began by putting it off, as I did regularly when I was 16, 17, 18, 19. But I got to it eventually, and when I started reading this diary, I found the most astonishing synthesis of a life of someone who had stepped off one of the very first boats to arrive here at Otago, having bought a piece of land off a map that seemed to indicate that it might be flat pasture land. He had purchased the other side of the harbour cone, and he had purchased, in fact, what really amounts to a cliff face of dense bush and hard rock. And what I found as I worked my way through this is that there were different kinds of information, there were different clues. He had kept a fastidious account of every penny he had spent, every penny that it had cost to run his home, as well as the farming business. The only income he actually made, really, was the income he made moonlighting across the hill at Larnock's Castle as it was being built. And as I started to analyse the figures, I started to find this human story underneath, a really engaging human story of hardship, endeavour and resilience. And what I didn't know then, and what I now know, is that I was learning the hard way how to do quant and qual evaluations of evidence, the ingredients that really add up to research. Sadly, I squandered that knowledge, and my first years at university were entertaining, enriching, and a total and complete failure. I think I'm possibly the only person in this room to have not one but two F failures in his first 2 years of study. So I disappeared. There may be more. And what I did was I eventually became an art teacher, and I have enjoyed nothing more than teaching art for the 40 years since then. But as I sort of developed my teaching, I discovered other things. The first of which was that learning and practicing and teaching and learning an art are themselves a research process. It's an iterative pathway in which we engage in a sort of a long-term development of ideas and imagery. And then I was lucky enough during my, I think 15th or 16th year at King's High School to get a teaching fellowship. I was housed in what was then the Soviet Studies Department. Between Mikhail Gorbachev and my own sort of need to get back to work, that dissolved at exactly the same time as the Soviet Union. I then was lucky enough 5 years later to have a Teaching Study Award, which allowed me to be a student full-time for a year. And the two of those experiences, I think, really crystallised my engagement with the interface between teaching and research, and my desire to sort of move into a setting in which the two could complement one another in richer ways, if I could. So I came to work at the college, and subsequently I've developed an interface between three different research interests, and that's possibly unusual. I think most of us really research intensely in a field and then perhaps develop and move on. But really the key focus for me is the first of these. I've been really fortunate as a child to grow up in an era in which New Zealand led the world in visual arts education. For 30 years, under the auspices of the TOVI scheme, primary art education and advisory services flourished in this country and really were the envy of many nations around the world. As I grew a little older, things started to change, certainly from when I started at the college. In the first year of college, the ministry decided to cut funding for teacher training by 25%. The 4-year degree became a 3-year degree. And at the same time, we've had a development of changes in curriculum that have embraced way more than a focus on making art, which had been for decades before then, since 1876 in fact. The thing that really engaged me was the opportunity to teach not just how to make art, but how to understand it, how to engage with it, the worlds it comes from, the worlds it belongs to, the people who it's for, and what it means to them. And that's been a really enriching experience. And that, I think, is the thing that has enriched art education in New Zealand since 1989. The other side of the coin is that preparation for teaching and support services for teaching have shrunk incrementally since that time. And we now have levels of engagement that really are no better than they were at the late 19th century. And what we've discovered, in the visual arts at least, is that teachers are having to turn to new directions to find ways of learning, ways of teaching and learning in these areas of what I sort of very broadly term aesthetic learning. And one of the places they've gone to is cultural institutions or museums in their very broadest sense. And one of the reasons they've gone there is that in many museums, we have outstanding educators who provide new approaches, new visions for teachers and young people going in with them, and learning with objects, meeting artworks at first hand, handling objects when it's appropriate, and learning about different, or through different kinds of evidence. So they are really the two phenomena that have moulded my approach to research and now my teaching in art education. The question I'm always asked is, David, why are you interested, the word they usually use is obsessed, with Japanese visual culture? And the odd thing here is that, in fact, this is the thing that came much later. I was interested in other cultures because my grandmother was brought up in India until she was almost 20. And her house had Benares ware and various other things that she'd brought out when she'd immigrated to New Zealand. That, I think, sowed a seed of interest in diverse cultures and the way they can be embraced into my research and my learning. But there was a couple of little landmark points where things started to crystallise about Japanese art. And one of them came on the last Saturday of September 1981. Helen and I we got a job in Dunedin, and we came down to look for a house. And we were taken up to see a house in Kenmure Road. And I remember quite vividly walking into this house. It had the three things that I could not do without in 1981. It had avocado green shag pile carpet. It had a conversation pit, and it had, as you walked into the bathroom, you started in a sea of blues and greens and whites, and as you walked around and into the shower, the wave, the dragon's claw foam of Hokusai's great wave crested above your head, directly above the shower rose. We went straight out, we made an offer. The estate agent phoned it into the office. We had missed out on the house by 4 minutes. It's possibly a blessing. I have no idea to this day how many bedrooms it had, and I really don't care. And it wasn't until some time after that that I started to ponder on this picture. What had actually struck me about it was not just the fact that it was a pretty cool bathroom for 1981, but the fact that here was a picture that everyone seemed to know. A picture of verging on universal significance. Why? Well, by that stage it had achieved an international currency and a transcultural one. It's, I don't know whether you've noticed, but it's on the Fijian coinage. I don't know whether you've noticed, but the wave has been a guest on the Muppets twice. You may not have noticed this, but it is the only artwork in history to become an emoji. And in addition to that, it is an image of the rising tide of defiance in Ulster Street art. It's one of the British Museum's 100 most important objects in the world. And in particular, and perhaps most poignantly, I think, on the coast of Rhode Island, a rising flock of gulls, 230, commemorate the lives of everyone lost on TWA Flight 800 in 1996. And in fact, that poignance is something that I think underpins the significance of this work for its original audiences. Hokusai lived in the city of Edo. Edo's the town we now know as Tokyo. And by his lifetime, it had grown to be the most populous city in the world and one of the most well-educated. There was a huge hunger for works of art like this. This is called an ukiyo-e, a floating world picture, and it catered to the interests of people with a particularly middle-class people who had affluence and a desire to enjoy life to the full. And art was one of the things they enjoyed the most. In 1833, when they looked at this picture, what would they have seen? Well, interestingly, they would have seen things that aren't actually in the picture. This is a picture from above the waters of Sagami Bay, looking northwards towards Kanagawa Prefecture. And to the east, behind the wave on the right, they would have known there was the town of Kamakura, the town that has rich cultural significance in Japan, site of shrines, temples, brothels run by the shrines as their primary source of income. And it was also the place where the bakufu, the military government of the shoguns, was really crystallized. On the left, behind the wave itself, Hakone, which is a town of bathhouses, onsen, a town well known for its entertainments, a town much celebrated for its wide views across the Kanto. And stretching between them, and between Edo and today's Kyoto, the Tokaido Highway, significant route between the old city of the emperors and the new city of the shoguns. So this is a picture in which they would have seen some historical significance. They also would have seen a much richer significance that we share with them. The fact that in Japan, nothing is as close to daily experience as the meeting between land and sea, the margins, if you like, between land travel, settlement, existence, and this key route for both shipping and for fishing. The waters in the inland sea were in places extremely dangerous. A fact commented on by people like Dr. Thomas Holland, people like the Truby Kings, when they travelled there, recorded the difficult passages in their diaries. And what we now know is that, in fact, lives were lost quite frequently on those seas. So for Hokusai's public, this was an image of the frailty of human life, human existence, in relation to the power of nature. It's not an image of the sublime in the European sense. Japanese sensibilities occupy quite different territories, but it is an image of ephemerality, which is a recurrent theme in Japanese arts. Now, all of this is interesting for me, but it's also just a little ironic. It's ironic on two levels. In the first instance, this isn't a picture of a wave at all. This is actually a picture of a mountain. The mountain's Fuji, and this is one of somewhere between 200 and 300 images of Fuji that he did. In the second instance, this is neither a typical Japanese picture, though ironically, again, Hokusai is the one artist that every Japanese school student knows, and this is the one picture that they're almost certain to see. It's in the textbooks, and it's the only artist in their textbooks. So we have this sort of sustained currency. But in fact, Hokusai did 22,000 pictures in his life. He also wrote and published 240 books. And between all of that, this subject occupies some 240. Now, the second major way, there are two dimensions of that unusual quality. During Hokusai's time, an artist trained to do one subject and one subject only. A specialist at his day might focus on images of actors and do nothing else for their entire professional career. He engaged in every single subject that was available to him, and he did more than that. He would do anything. He did sweet wrappers for the local shop. It's the historical equivalent of designing Jimmy's pie bags. And what's interesting here is that he was equally successful in every single domain. It's only history, and in particular American historians, that have documented him as a specialist in landscapes, much celebrated for Fuji. That very feature made him unusual. He was known as, the word that would be used then was kijin, or crazy person. He really was eccentric in every sense. And I chose this picture to illustrate that because in his original biography, written just a couple of years after his death in Japan, the first 6 pages of chapter 2 are devoted entirely to accounts of his drunkenness. So clearly he was sober some of the time. He had to get the work done. The second thing that's quite unusual about Hokusai is, again, every artist trained generally through a 5, 6, 7-year apprenticeship. Hokusai's apprenticeship lasted for somewhere between 30 and 34 years. He didn't produce works that he was personally satisfied with until his mid-70s, and he told us so in a number of documents. What's interesting is he started the first apprenticeship at age 11. Age 13, he'd be headhunted into the leading studio of his day, the Katsukawa studio. He was precocious. His master was called Katsukawa Shunsho. So just as he reached the age of 15, Hokusai rechristened himself Shunro, spring brilliance, as against spring brightness for his master's name. So his ego cost him leadership of the school when his master died, but as you can see, he went on to study in a whole range of other domains. The other thing that I think we need to acknowledge here is that Fuji itself had rich significance in Japanese cultural context, particularly in Edo. It was a live volcano. It had last erupted in 1707. The view you have here is a century later, over a century later. The view you have in Japan Travel Board posters is this one. The other side has a crater about the size of this campus and a new mountain that was formed in 1707. Its characters, Fuji, means not equal, peerless. There is no other mountain equal to this. It is the highest mountain in Japan, and this symmetry and its perfect curves earned it that status. In Taoist histories, the characters are often read as Fu Shu, not death. And Fuji, the mountain, has associations with immortality that date at the very least back to the 3rd century, encapsulated in the story of the Isles of the Blessed, where the Chinese emperor sends emissaries to sea, cross the sea to the Islands of the Blessed, to climb its highest mountains, to bring back the elixir of life. Now, that myth reconstructs itself into Japanese cultural contexts again and again and again. It's most celebrated in Takutori Monogatari, the tale of the bamboo cutter and the moon maiden. The moon maiden being the baby that he found lying in the rushes and raised. And eventually returns to the moon. It's celebrated in classical drama, Fuji-san, Sister Fuji. Fuji has her own goddess, Sengen Daibosatsu, who is a woman. And what's interesting about that is that in order to gain access entry to the Pure Land after death, Yamabushi, mountain ascetics, would climb Mount Fuji, and that would be their reward in the afterlife. And that became a popular pastime for chonin, the citizens of Edo at the time. Sadly, less than half of them. Women weren't allowed to climb the mountain, which meant that they weren't allowed access to the Pure Land. Far-sighted people compensated, and in Hokusai's day, they built mini Fujis. At one stage, there were 8 built and constructed in different parts of the city for women to climb and thus gain their entry to an afterlife. I think the other thing here that we should acknowledge is that there's a very playful side to these works. And I didn't mention it until now because we need to see the whole picture, but Fuji's profile here is repeated in the foreground in these curving hulls of the boats, and then its slightly asymmetrical peak is reconstructed here right in the foreground. What's interesting is that in the 36 views of Fuji, which there are 46 in the series. Clearly it was very popular. And in the 100 views of Fuji later, in the 36 in particular, that visual play occurs in all but 2 of the images that he composed. We can see this notion of visual play as it sort of develops through his career too. The Great Wave has precedents. This is the earliest one. This is a picture of a group of a traveller on the left and a group who are visiting the beach on the island of Enoshima. It's a meisho as pictures of the mountain, a famous place picture. And we know that pictures of rough seas were quite popular. This one doesn't represent a sort of a nascent tsunami or giant wave. It's actually a sort of a very graphic description of a spring tide, very high tide, the kind that we now call a king tide, that are thundering against the walls of St Clair Esplanade at precisely 5:30 every morning at the moment. he developed and returned to this theme again and again and again, this time in new European style. You can see at the top right here, he's engaged a European copperplate style for his Japanese character writings, completely illegible as a result, but he was doing everything he could to engage with this whole new cultural context. And he reproduces it again in this image of the suicide of a loyal servant. Here we start to see some undercurrents of significance of this wave, both as the overwhelming tide of pain as he plunges his sword into his abdomen, but at the same time, in Shinto terms in particular, in terms of the cleansing power of the water and the wave as it crashes upon the rocks. The image of Isohangi and his lover here on the rocks is a reminder also of something else, of something that's a leitmotif in Hokusai's later works. And that something else is the ephemerality of life, of youth and beauty. And that repeats itself from the very early Heian period, the medieval period in Japanese history, in a notion, a sensibility called mono no aware. Aware is a sense of pathos, the underlying pathos of all things. With the 46 views of the 36 views of Fuji, he again developed a more compact course of graphic play. In each one, he plays the same games. We can see here the profile of Fuji echoed in the ferry here, the cargo boat here, and then in the upturned Manin Bridge, Maninbashi, across the river here as it enters the Sumida River. And again, this is a sort of a synthesis of both Western style art, it's in perspective, but also of traditional Japanese forms. Yamato-e, Japanese pictures, recorded images of daily life, the minutiae, little images of people fishing, the fire towers that were scattered around the city to save it in times of fire. It all burned down regularly. Here, the European impact is quite different. It's in the adoption of the colour that he knew as Berlin blue, or Berlin blue. The colour we know as Prussian blue, which had only just been allowed for common use by the authorities. It had been around for a while, but it all was a very tightly regulated society. And again, we can see here the profile of Fuji moving up here and down here. And here a much more subtle repetition between the slope and this boat. There's another theme starts to emerge through these works. What's really interesting about Hokusai is that although he travelled a lot, perhaps unusually for his age, he lived in the city, and the city was intensely populated. It was teeming with life. It was a difficult city to move in many ways. But he, in these late years in particular, very rarely ever depicted anything from the city. He focused on the hinterlands, he focused on the way Japan had looked in the past. He focused not politically, not with images of castles or famous landmarks, but with very, very simple views of everyday life. That notion of art compounding with ordinariness is very much a trope in many areas of Japanese art. Wabi-sabi is the term that many people will have engaged with, and that really informs, that underpins that. So we get this sort of notion of ordinariness, but we also get another dimension coming through, of people alone. There's one traveller in the ferry, there's one traveller walking along the bank with his laden horse. This notion of loneliness becomes quite a theme for Hokusai in his very last series. Again, a picture of the hinterlands, but in this case not of Fuji. It's set in the mountains, and this is an image from a series of a volume of poetry called Haiku Ishu. 100 people, one poem each. This was a volume of highly respected verses, very brief verses, as you'll see in a moment, that were compiled by a member of the imperial court 600 years earlier. And they were, in Hokusai's world, this was the reading that informed the cognitive knowledge stock of the day. And they were great readers. But reading the poetry of the classics, being able to quote them, being able to cite them with ease, was considered one of the most essential skills of any kind of social and intellectual intercourse. And indeed, if one was wealthy enough to visit the licensed brothel area, which might cost around, in today's money, around $25,000 to $30,000 for the evening, and which would in fact involve nothing more than, in fact, a meal and drinks and musicians and song singing and poetry exchanges. That ability to know the classical verses, to be able to exchange them, to be able to lead off half a line and for someone else to be able to pick it up on the other side of the room, underpinned people's ability to engage on a sophisticated and cultivated level. In this instance, he illustrated every one of the poems not with a picture of the person who wrote it, not with a picture of anyone it might have been about, but with a picture of a landscape with people in it. And the landscape here is quite an interesting one. It's a mountain landscape in the middle of winter. And in Japan, winter is associated with loneliness, with isolation, obviously with cold. The hunters and foresters gathered around the fire depicted in something that was very familiar to Edo viewers. Each one of them is holding a pose. Pose was from the Kabuki theatre. It's called a mie pose. Kabuki plays take forever. They can be 8 hours long, they can be 9 hours long. The most famous one is 11 hours long. And they're punctuated with intervals and food and so on. But they're also punctuated with moments of high drama. And mie quite typically occur when an actor stops at a critical moment in their narrative and seizes a pose and stands there frozen and silent to emphasize the moment. Every one of these actors or characters is in such a pose. What's interesting about this picture is that beyond its isolation, beyond its winter theme, this is a picture about silence. The hunters and the foresters, words are lost in the lattice work of smoke and flame and snow. The poem constructs what was known as an utamakura, an elusive poetic evocation of place, not a specific landmark again, but of an environment, a setting, if you like. And it mentions the mountains. Winter is linked directly with loneliness. And the remainder of the poem increases most when I think about how both have dried up, the grasses and people's visits. Talk about as it were, a period in which there is no richness and health, a period of great sadness. And that's echoed in this word ukiyo, which is the word that probably is the most commonly associated with this period. Ukiyo means floating world. And for the men and women who lived in Edo, what that signified was a world in which you lived for the moment. It was a very hedonist, within a narrow group of people, a very hedonist ethos in which people enjoyed food and drink, theatre, music, verse, and art like this. But in Buddhist contexts, ukiyo means something quite different. this notion of ephemerality of life, this fleeting world of sorrow. So, as we come to the last few minutes, why is all of this important to us today? Well, I think the first reason is that Hokusai's voyage gives us quite interesting insights into what we very broadly call a creative practice and creative dispositions or dispositions to innovation. In the first instance, these pictures were pictures of great significance to their original public. They meant something to them. It's not that they helped them make sense of their own world, it helped them remember the worlds of the past. It helped them remember the worlds that they had kind of lost touch with in their urban centre. And that notion that creativity is underpinned by innovation that is of value is the one that's most clearly crystallised in a video that many of you will have watched by Sir Ken Robinson, I think one of the very first TED Talks. It's epitomised by Hokusai's polymath curiosity, his eccentricity, his restless thirst to engage in new things all of the time. It's identifiable in this cognitive stock around Fuji and classical literature and the land, and particularly the margins between land and sea, which are the cognitive stock that gave a common ground of understanding, but which also informed what Steve Jobs celebrates most about creative practice, the abilities to take risks and make links, connection making. There's an element of accident in that. But within that, there is the notion that Louis Pasteur voiced, that in fact, if we have that rich cognitive stock to build on, chance favours the prepared mind. And finally, there is a way of working through from idea into practice that requires some kind of procedural methodology. And the key here for Hokusai and his world was this disposition to asobi, or play. The second reason these pictures matter is because they have a real significance for the way we understand learning today, and alongside learning, teaching. The first thing is that I think within my lifetime, the world has experienced a significant change in its worldview. In my childhood, Keith Sinclair published one of the first books that gave us a total view or a broad view of New Zealand history. It's called, creatively, A History of New Zealand. The very final sentence of that book tells us, if not verbatim, in spirit at least, the thing that distinguishes New Zealand culture from every other place in the world is that we are as one. We are one culture and one social world. That's been challenged by just about every historian that's followed him. And what we now think about in terms of education and learning, and particularly in my experience working in museums and my attraction to museums, is because they provide first-hand engagements with the artifacts of other cultures from other times, from all over the world. And I think that's a significant change that changes young people's view of the world as they're developing now in ways that never happened before. It also helps us understand how artists work, and understanding how artists work helps us understand what they produce. And finally, I mentioned at the beginning that the significant change in art education in this country in the last 30 years, or perhaps 35, is a shift or an expansion of interest to include and embrace learning about art and its worlds, art and its artists, and art and the people who enjoy it. And the ability to engage with art was what Richard Wollheim, the philosopher, called the practice of critical retrieval. Sadly, Richard Wollheim never ever told us how to do critical retrieval. However, Hokusai, I think, does in a very real way. And the third reason that this is significant today is that between Christchurch, between Fukushima, we are perhaps more acutely aware today of the potentials for environmental catastrophe, either made by ourselves or emerging from the forces of nature, than we probably have ever been before. I can remember vividly when there was an earthquake in Assisi, reading about it in the newspaper, and watching an article, a documentary about it 3 years, 4 years later. Now we see it happening. And I think that changes our whole world view of the precarious hold we have on the world we have. The second thing is that these works sustain really significant sensibilities and values across time and cultures. And finally, they can teach us more about the worlds people live in, more about the people in those worlds than most other areas of study. And finally, they teach us how art provides a vehicle that can cross borders, taking or sharing understandings and engagements and sensibilities between cultures and peoples. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Tony Ballantyne and I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor Humanities, and it is with great pleasure that I'll deliver a vote of thanks to Professor Bell. He has delivered an excellent lecture, a set of reflections that have woven together his deep engagement with art history, his particular interest in Japanese aesthetic traditions, his commitment to art education, and to education more generally. He has offered a rich set of readings of this now iconic image that is repeatedly reworked here with an orange hint. And of course, he began by placing it in the cultural landscape of Hokusai's Japan and in that country's distinctive visual culture. There, David introduced us to the incredible range and depth of Hokusai's talents, his deep commitment to mastering a host of aesthetic traditions, his passion, his restlessness, and playfulness that chafed against convention and underpinned his immense creativity. I think David has really offered an incredibly evocative reading of this image, a kind of multiple contextualization that aids those of us unfamiliar with Hokusai or with the visual arts or with Japanese culture to make sense of the richness and complexity of this image. I also think that David's lecture has demonstrated many of the qualities that make him such a respected figure in both our art communities and our educational communities. He is thoughtful, imaginative, and incredibly engaging. He has offered a compelling set of reflections on the interplay between the creative arts and society, between research and teaching, and between teaching and learning. And of course, those are all concerns at the heart of our mission here at the university. I also know from personal experience that David is a tremendous teacher. I know that because he was my fourth form art teacher. And I think it is true that at some point in the career, every teacher comes up against a student who cannot be helped. I'm afraid that in David's case, I was that student. But what I can attest to is that David was greatly respected by my peers. Now, respect is not something that comes easy or naturally to 14 and 15-year-old boys. But David was held in high esteem because of his love for his subject and because his love of teaching was so evident and contagious. And I think he has conveyed that passion and enthusiasm this evening, and I know that those are values that are very highly valued by his students and his colleagues at the college. So, Professor Bell, we have greatly enjoyed your talk, and we have enjoyed coming together to join in this celebration of your promotion. So I invite everyone to join me in thanking David. I do have a gift to present to him, and I would also invite you to join the academic party for a reception in the staff club. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony. You're all right. Great. Oh, thank you. Thank you all very much. I'm going to enjoy something cool and refreshing very, very soon, so please do join us if you can. And thank you again, all of you, for coming. I really appreciate it. Yes, thanks, Ali.